Good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. And delighted to have you all join us for this informal kind of conversation with dear friend Marko, who is, among many things, he's now heading the Helsinki Art Festival. And they just finished the art festival, which was quite a bit of change, because I think this is the first time you did it virtually, given the conditions. Maybe we can start there, Marko. How did the festival go?
Well, as I was saying to someone, I'm both exhausted and exhilarated, but indeed, it was a kind of COVID edition. The Helsinki Festival is the largest multi-arts festival in the Nordics. Normally we stage large concerts, but this year, because we couldn't convene audiences safely, so we couldn't bring people to the art, we then devised, normally we're 18 days long, we were a long weekend, we called it the Helsinki Fest weekend. We did 30 concerts in the courtyards of Helsinki, where people were watching from their balconies and through their windows. If you remember this, perhaps you may have seen a scene of or a frame of an Italian tenor during the hard Italian lockdown. Keep that frame in your mind and then multiply that across the city. But then we streamed from these concerts, so over 17 hours of live television, all of it streamed, and radio. So, and that is all on the internet. So it wasn't really a virtual, I like to think of it as an safe urban festival and communal experience of art, but we had a much larger component of broadcast and streaming. We also, as a lead up, we did a thing, we can maybe discuss it later if it's relevant, but we allowed people to order a gift, an art gift, to people in Helsinki, a loved one or a friend. And this was delivered, it was ordered with an app and delivered. 300 of them were given all over Helsinki. And it was quite moving, actually. There was dance and circus and music of all kinds, poetry. It was a surprise to the gift giver as well. So it was, and we open sourced that application last week, just before the weekend, and gave it as a gift, kind of a meta gift to all of our colleagues working with festivals and the arts around the world, because it is, as in many other domains, but it is a very challenging time for festivals and art venues. So thank you for asking. I'll maybe share, if it's appropriate, some notes. And we started with Arvo Pärt's Passio, which is an incredible piece of meditative and really quite sacred music, I would say. And I can share some of those links.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So how should we proceed with this thing? What do you have in mind?
Well, I think there are a few angles. This is in thanks, partly Tenzin was able to be at Helsinki Festival last year. We were talking about art and other intelligences, artificial intelligences. And I was walking, I read and listened to your book, which was a delight, walking on the seaside in Helsinki. And then some of these themes came up. I think we could discuss it, start the conversation from a multitude of directions, from the point of view of what is art for, perhaps, and how that's related to both the artistic work. I think I recognize some friends also on the call. There are artists here, which is good, and I think many different practitioners from the point of view of making art, but then also of the experience of art. And I think there's quite a few intersection points. Helsinki recently actually published, a small group did a kind of vision to provoke the politicians, a vision for the art and culture of the city. And I was just reading it, and it was quite well done. And there was a page in there discussing, it's kind of the people that contributed to this vision wrote one page in this book, kind of reflecting on some specific topic important to them. And this was an artist called Teemu Mäki, and he wrote a little bit about what is meant when we say that art has inherent value, what he thinks people mean by this. And I think it's maybe an interesting frame to discuss some of the roles. So if looking at the inherent value of art, and this is a topic that has been discussed as long as art has been there. One sense of it is, and I don't mean it in a shallow sense, but art is seen as a sense of enjoyment or pleasure. It can be either that in an escapist sense, that you go to experience art to forget about life or other experiences, but it doesn't need to be escapist. It could also be reality seeking in some kind of way, meaning that actually the experience of art and interaction with it allows us to somehow face our own reality or our collective reality in as honest and holistic way as possible. So in this sense, you could see that it's almost epistemic. It's meant to create some new knowledge or awareness of our situation. The other kind of this enjoyment is one way of thinking about it. The other, I think, is as almost like a diverse and multi-sensorial way of doing critical thinking. And many artists are talking about contemporary issues, be that the climate crisis or the current situation we're in, accumulation of wealth, injustice. And the artistic works can sometimes be vehicles for having those conversations. And in that sense, that conversation can be seen as having further benefits to society, even though what I think people mean when they talk about the inherent value of art are these elements of enjoyment, whether reality seeking or escapist, or then this kind of a kind of way to have a dialogue about philosophical or critical issues. And in this sense, many people, though not all, would say that this kind of artistic reflection also increases interpersonal understanding and compassion. So these are a few links, I think, to the contemplative traditions on the one hand, and then on what art is for. I think, furthermore, I think there are many sort of themes around the experience of art. I was just reading an interview by Brian Eno, the artist and musician and producer, and some of his art practice involves generative, very calming pieces. These are algorithmically or with some system created environments, and he's built them both for museums and collectors, but also for hospitals, either convalescing after operations and so on. And he often describes the work and the experience of the work as a process of letting go of control and of surrendering. And I've heard that kind of language also describing other situations. I think in addition to that, then there's a whole thread, if people are interested in that, in artistic practice and overlap, different kinds of pre-creation or pre-creativity or before routines and rituals for prior to a performance, particularly if it's a physically or cognitively taxing kind. So we could discuss any of those depending on where the group is interested, and many examples, of course, would be good.
Yeah, I think, one of the interesting thing when we talk about religious art or contemplative art is that it served, I think, a particular kind of purpose. There's, of course, a subset of people who believe that religion itself is an escape phenomena. So within religious institutions, if you were somebody devoted to art, you could be seen as somebody escaping religious institutions and things of that nature. But that's sort of one side of the equation. But the whole idea of devotional art, which is that using art not just as an expression, meaning it was a process, And I think, depending on the medium or modality of art that one practiced, whether it was visual or music or writing poetry and so on, I think, one of the interesting thing was that it was more about the process rather than just the finished piece. Coming from a contemplative side of things. The second interesting thing that was intriguing is that almost all the beautiful art pieces, at least in Asia, that were of religious or devotional in nature, we actually don't know who the artist is, and somehow the tradition is still sort of carried on to this day in some ways where you cannot tell from a mural or a painting or a tanka or a statue the signature of an artist. So there was this whole thing about creating the best art possible because you were trying to sort of it was an act of devotion, so it was an expression in that regard, but not taking credit for it, you see. And the idea that and these are not sort of tiny sort of objects of art. I mean, I'm talking about statues carved on the face of mountains, that perhaps was started by one artist and then generationally taken up by another artist that has been there for hundreds of thousands of years. One that made to international news for unfortunate reasons was the Buddha statue at Bamiyan in Afghanistan. Gigantic pieces of art, but not knowing who actually created them. So there's this interesting thing about taking credit for art within the devotional and the religious context and what it means. Meaning that the contemporary discourse on art. I mean, taking credit is fine, but the letting go of ego versus affirmation of ego. Because in my experience, there are artists who are tremendous artists, who are also tremendous individuals, who are the most humble of people that I've met. And also I've encountered artists who are the most egotistical individuals that are there. And it's quite a spectrum. And of course, there are people in between as well, right? But that's an interesting thing to for me to observe within the religious world. And then the expression of devotion, which has been interesting, that, like, for example, in the Italian culture, after 12th century, pretty much every famous painter tried or attempted to paint St. Francis of Assisi, for example, as an act of devotion, basically, that, whether they had become famous or they had not become famous, but there was this thing that I'm going to do one artwork of a prominent saint or a prominent religious personality, this as an act of offering. And those are the things that is interesting, sort of places that one is the process itself, what art does to oneself, versus art simply seen as an expression of the self. And of course, there are many divisions of art, like, the idea of political art or art changing things or creating movements like the Bauhaus and the Dada, and we have seen, like, a whole range of things. But I'm more interested in firstly exploring this whole sense of the contemplative aspect of art, like what happens. And you and I have talked about with regard to music, so let's not, maybe we can talk about the performance aspect of it secondary, but what's happening internally prior to performance, the sense of preparedness that comes with it.
I think many themes there. Let's see where we start with. I think first I would say that even this kind of perhaps ego-driven or artist or star artist connected art world I see currently, and there's a history of that. Bauhaus is an example, even though we point to certain people that were involved with it, and I see more and more collectives making art, and the process of that collective to bring about art, especially young artists, are doing more and more, and it's really quite. There's also a lot of discussion about the space in which the preparation gets made and how it's made safely and how is everyone heard. And so, and even in large scale contemporary visual or architectural arts, this happens. The studios can be 20 people, 50 people, 100 people. So this solitary, that those are of course rare examples, the very, very big ones. But so this solitariness of the artist is perhaps also not reflecting artistic practice as much. There's definitely in music, the sense compared to contemplative practice, there's also the very real reality of having to prepare and to practice and all of those things. But even in that, the art forms differ in some cases. Traditionally, a symphony orchestra, I recall when you came to Helsinki, I think I took you to your first rock concert, which I couldn't really believe.
Yes.
But and which I still enjoy, and it was a good show. But then, just in preparing this, I found that you have made a chant record, so which you said has no entertainment value, but I found it very beautiful. So in preparing for that, I think in contemporary classical music or classical performance practice at the moment in the West, yeah, it's very much a quite condensed view. A soloist comes in, you have a certain number of run-throughs, and then you go. Theater and dance productions are much more workshopped. And so the process is not only contemplative, but collectively so in creating meanings and language for a performance, even how it's structured. And I think there's a lot of mixing of these practices. There are very interesting new groups. One is Stargaze, works with a lot of a freelance collective founded by Andre de Ridder, the conductor, and they work a lot with workshopping, for example, with dance companies. So they're almost working like a performing arts group from outside of music, in addition to be top of the game. There, I think you also said that the process may be more important. There's also a long philosophical tradition or questions about, Arthur Danto wrote about it most, but what makes the Warhol's Brillo boxes, what brings that into the art world versus the Brillo boxes at the store? Now, I don't think this definitional question is so important, but what he was trying to say is aesthetically, feature by feature, aesthetically identical works. One is art, one is not. So we can't tell them from that point of view. And in his case, it's the process of the art world theorizing about them, what he called the institutional theory of art. He later distanced himself from that. But this idea that actually that even the meaning of what defines it is actually an institutional collective thing, if you follow from there. I think there is also, we had one artist at the festival, we took over all of the advertising displays at the festival, which we would have used to sell tickets at the festival tent, which you visited, and we gave them to 7 young Nordic artists to display. And one of the artists says, I don't want my name in there, it doesn't matter, I don't want. So there's also in the current art world people that are not signing if they don't wish to.
Right. No, it's an interesting thing. I mean, historically, of course, we know people who wrote under different pen names, because either of the fear of persecution or whatnot. I mean, there were a variety of reasons why people did not take direct credit, but there's something interesting that I find in the religious art, like even looking at sort of when I've had the opportunity to visit, for example, Russia, Russian Federation numerous times, and I'm sort of mesmerized by the Orthodox, Russian Orthodox iconography, and imagery. And you know, these are all, it's very interesting. So one is that the whole process is meditative, but then these artworks are actually used as objects of meditation, right? Meaning that they become devotional objects in many regards. And maybe, you know, that was a reason that the artists were like, I don't want them to think about when they're thinking about the divine, that there needs to be a single pointed concentration or an act of devotion to the object of meditation. But there's this interesting sort of, how should I put it? It's an interesting focus on the object being, and it's not necessarily that's in iconography. Like if, when we, come to Zen, it's a lot of it is just abstract art. But even that abstract art, when used as an object of meditation, sort of triggers, certain kinds of processes. So one of the things is this notion of art for the purpose of freedom, for the purpose of liberation, right? This idea that it's supposed to challenge our preconceived notions or ideas, or even sort of the box of conceptuality that we are in, and sort of truly step out of the self. And I remember during one of our conversations when we were talking about non-duality and non-dual experiences, sort of the spectrum of it, and we discussed many catalysts in that. Music as a, it's again, there are religious practices that prescribe music, and there are religious institutions that are weary of music, that are afraid of music. So there are traditions where music is banned, dancing is banned, because they believe that it takes us away from our point of focus to other traditions where it becomes sort of this aspect that you can actually step away from yourself, step away from your ego. What do you think of in your own experience as you create music or as you experience music, the sense of stepping away from the self as either the creator or the listener or the witness of these works?
I think one example which I was pointed to when or thought of when you were saying this is actually the composer I mentioned, Arvo Pärt, the Estonian composer. And he changed, I hope some of you are familiar with his music, and if not, please, P.A. umlaut R.T. is his last name, Estonian composer, who in the 70s, after a short period of silence, radically changed his style and created a new compositional style that he called tintinabuli, which is then has been reflected in many of his works since then, like Spiegel im Spiegel is one example, and Tabula Rasa, Fratres. And what is odd is the process is, the result is it is minimal, but I wouldn't say it minimalist. It's very spare in materials, but also very packed with emotion, and yet the process itself is quite algorithmic. So this comes to your point, is one way that this has been approached, actually in an interesting way, perhaps ties Brian Eno and Arvo Pärt together. You devise a system which creates the thing, but you just create the system which creates it, but then you don't intervene later. So it is a different kind of ego, if you like. It's a systems maker. Then there may be, of course, the critical moment at which you break the system or surprise. But I think that kind of approach to the process of art, similar things are in visual arts. Maybe the most like Solowitz line drawings and the sort of instruction drawings and paintings, which are really there is no exact view of what it will be, because it's just a set of rules to make the work on that surface.
It's an interesting sort of trend. One of the I dabble with the Japanese and Chinese calligraphy, and one of the artists that I admired was a Chinese opera singer and opera writer, very prominent in late 18th, early 19th century, named Hongi. And he was one of these guys who was a womanizer and really loved his wine, and created beautiful works of opera, and then decided to become a monk. Like some radical shift. And very hard for people to think, like, was there some experience or something? Like, he wasn't. He didn't go through some kind of miserable experience in life to like a dramatic experience to make this jump. He was at the peak point of his career, and he decides to become a monk. And then after he became a monk, he still sort of did artwork and works of calligraphy, but you could see sort of somehow that the entire the entire sort of work has now been characterized by a sense of simplicity, and it's beautiful. Like he actually one of the practices that they do is copy Buddhist texts, and so he made this copy of the Heart Sutra, one of the very popular texts in the Buddhist tradition, and the strokes, the brush strokes that he's using, to sort of copy the text, it's just remarkably simple and elegant kind of thing, and that's another thing that it's very interesting to see that some of the artists, that as they're going through certain kinds of experiences, I'm sure there are cases of people who probably after a spiritual or religious experience create more complex forms of art. But most examples that I've seen are kind of the simplicity aspect that comes in, and the simplicity even in terms of the admiration of things that they're paying attention to. I remember a brief conversation with a very prominent sort of Tibetan artist, Thangka artist, who did all the murals for the Dalai Lama's temple. And we were sitting one day, and I said, as a monk, I always get these questions about happiness. You are somebody who has, devoted your entire life to training in art, and Buddhist art, you have to sort of familiarize yourself, and you still have to go through certain kind of discipline of how you go about it. So I asked him, so what makes you happy? And he paused for a bit, and then he said, the right shade of blue. So what makes me happy is the right shade of blue. And I said, oh, could you point to that right shade of blue? And so he's giving me a tour of his murals that he did in the Dalai Lama's temple, and he said, I have imagined it, but I still haven't quite gotten to it. But it looks something like this. So he pointed to this particular piece in the wall that he had done, this mural, and he pointed to this shade of cobalt blue. And he said, I imagined it to be that blue that would make me happy, but it hasn't gotten to that blue yet, and it was just delightful, this exchange where there was this sense of meticulousness, a sense of particularity, but also the sense of joy that was that you could see in the process of this creation and so on. And again, if you don't know, you wouldn't know who painted all those murals. He did not sign it anywhere or didn't take credit for it in that way. coming to, a little bit about this kind of practice of things that we talked a bit about sort of the most immediate thing, and we have talked about music or certain kinds of visual performances as a collaborative art form. But given what the world has gone through in the last 6-7 months, it has also given kind of a forced experience of solitariness or a sense of solitude. Have you seen any kind of difference or any insights between, when you experienced solitude prior to this pandemic, going to remote parts of Finland and creating music versus these experiences in the last 6-7 months of your interaction with creating music or listening to music and this experience of solitude?
It's a very good question. And I think also I have tried to have conversations with artists about it. My own musical practice is, I have a band. The other person is a professor at the University of Washington in Seattle, Nadia Peak. And we are used to collaborating face to face. So it was also, first of all, just a way of developing a practice of how do we work without actually being able to hear. So you are able to nowadays do something that is one way, that I can play to something that is being created on the spot somewhere else. But the signal, because of the delays, can't go back. So we've developed these ways of reading cues, so not solitary. But the other thing that frankly got me somehow through the lockdown, both my parents are in their 80s and had COVID-19 and survived, but it was quite day by day, is just creating these almost sound environments and very, very, if you like, ambient pieces. So I would try to, again, this has to do with preparation, but I would just sit down and start playing the piano, even though I'm not a pianist, I play quite a bit, and then record these. But I have to say that while this physical distancing was happening, I still found it, which you can do these days, is you just put the stuff out there immediately, almost without an edit. So I was just sharing things online to do that, not to get a kick of the likes or who cares about it, but rather maybe it's as a form of encouragement that others could do so. I found that very many, it depends again on art form, but even in those among artists, this question of collaboration and how do the groups work together has been a real issue. And that was one of the reasons finally kind of why we definitely wanted to do an urban festival last weekend, is we wanted the communal experience of art with the windows open and people looking and experiencing it together. Now, we don't know why that affects us differently. I suppose I've heard of a few studies looking, measuring physiology, brain activity and other things that maybe we could point to it. This is a longer topic, but why is it that when we experience the group playing, the string quartet playing in front of us, it feels different than watching a videotape of them playing in another room, or watching a videotape that we're told them that is of them playing live in the other room, but actually it's coming from a recording from yesterday. How are we reacting differently? And we just found that this sense of the live performance and that feeling, that there has been just such a yearning for it. And as we met the artists after the festival, many of them said, we have not seen each other for 6 months. We have not, this is when we were able to play together. So I think the solo from the living room is limited also in terms of how the feeling is. But I know that there are people on this call who have been doing long performances online. So I hope we'll hear from them.
One of the other things before I open it up for discussion, I think it's a small enough group that we could actually probably just have a discussion or conversation in some ways. two other aspects of art when I think of. One is the notion of art as as a as a place of healing, as a mode of healing. So this this thing, that engaging in the process of creating art, or even sort of witnessing certain art forms being done as a process of self-healing and healing for community and so on. And we have it's a thing that I've encountered quite a bit, both in the spiritual terms, but also with work done in sort of communities in Latin America, for example, that have been torn by years of civil war and things, that it provides a certain kind of healing method that goes beyond just a process of dialogue and things like that. It's like when they come together, to create music or to paint a mural on the wall together, despite of their divided opinion or politics or perception of things, there's a sense of common humanity that it does bring out, which has been very, very interesting to witness. But the other aspect of it is also this notion of awe, or the experience of awe, and that is something that we encounter quite a lot in sort of the religious domain, when we talk about the expression or the experience of awe. And it's in some ways, fortunately or unfortunately, it's also a metric of how we measure religious art or architecture, meaning, is it something that inspires, or is it something that triggers awe, and so on. What's your thought on these two things, the quality of healing as art, and given that I think when you were in Cambridge, you were actually working on some aspects of music and healing, and the sense of awe.
Yes, in Cambridge, we were working on using music and algorithmically generated sound and personalized sound and music for therapeutic purposes, either for pain management or sleep disorders. And there's a growing and increasingly convincing body of research around that on a multitude of connections, because music has so much to do with the clocking of our brain, and beat perception seems fundamental to certain healthy functioning. And so applications also to areas like Parkinson's. But this was quite, in some ways, and it was very helpful for us to take walks with you during the time at the Sync project, which is now part of Bose Corporation. We were looking at it. I think in that case, we were trying to identify quite broad and basic mechanisms. So using music to help in regulating breathing and calming down as a result. And so we were still working on quite basic mechanisms, and whether you would use the word healing for that, or also processing healing may seem like a larger thing, but these links are evident. So I think my own view and hope is that in 20 years, this will be absolutely normal way of treatment practice in certain conditions, that you'll be able to also assign sensory art as medicine, if you like, or precision medicine, depending on the case. The sense of awe, I think we all recognize it internally, but one thing in music, the term often is used, very everyday word, but chills, a certain chord change or a certain moment. For me, last movement of Sibelius 5, there's a moment which does it every time. There's a as I was telling a friend, Arvopat Spazio, I'll share the recording, an hour, 6 minutes and 40 seconds. If you don't lose it at that point, then we need to talk. And it's after an hour of almost nothing happening. Of course, there's the whole passion and the text and the religious context, but then it just let's go. And even now, as I'm describing it, I'm getting those sensations. So that is, I think there's another aspect of awe, which is like the awe of a experience of oneness with nature, or seeing that which you so beautifully describe in the book and in the penultimate chapter. And then also, I think this period of solitude has been so important for that we have realized the systemic, or at least pointed out the systemic challenges that, what we are doing to destroy certain systems, and now we can realize that. So I think the similar feeling to being a part of a larger whole has to do with also the social experience of art, particularly with music. When you see together that moment when someone takes a risk on stage, or something that clearly goes, this is a somewhat tangential, but I think it may be related to awe. A friend who also played the weekend, Jukka Perko, lovely Finnish sax player, he used to stage at his festival an evening, what he called the evening of the wrong instruments, where some of the top European jazz instrumentalists would play their third or fourth instrument, so not even their second instrument. And he said, we do this so that we rediscover the joy of making music of an amateur, when you're surprised when you hit the right note. And so there you saw the kind of joy of, I made it, I hit it. So
I think that's part of the beauty that sometimes I wish more people would engage in, because we are so caught up in becoming experts in certain fields, and we are so worried and afraid of leaving our expertise behind, that in some ways it kills our sense of curiosity and this joy of discovery, or hitting the right tone, or the right note with the third and fourth knowledge domains or instruments and so on. I think it's something that we need to sort of explore more often. There's a question by Michael. I think you can see it on the chat. There's a whole beautiful preface to the question. But how do you use art to become a better person?
I'm just reading the introduction.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I like this. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Please say first.
Well, I was going to say I like the Geet thing, the to see what holds the earth together in its innermost elements. And I remember one time in Warsaw, I saw a poster that says, "Earth without art is just eh." Go ahead, please, Marko.
Yeah. So I'm not sure I do. It seems presumptuous to say that one does not, at least predictably. But I think maybe one is a sense of healthy humility, at least related to practice and being able to do something. This is a very basic thing, but we were doing a performance of a piece by Terry Riley called In C, maybe familiar to the participants in the call. It's a classic of minimalism. It's a very collective, interesting piece, scored for any collection of instruments. There's tens of patterns that you have to go through, playing each pattern, and you can stick as long as you'd like to one pattern. And this forms this collective thing. But there are a couple of the patterns which at a certain tempo are pretty tough for a bass player, where they sit on the, and so I think there's a kind of certain overcoming that, but then also recognizing limits. The other is I find, and this is a thread, admittedly, that I'm obsessed with, but I am interested in kind of sound as tapestry and kind of this kind of work that Brian Eno has done, these environments you live in. When I was a student and I was extremely stressed, I would just put on one of Brian's or some other composer's ambience, and I'd have microphones and instruments, and occasionally I'd add something, a very, very long loop of something into and this was what I lived in. So it was kind of my crutch to stay present and calmer. And I wonder, so I think that has been another, is trying to make these environments, also give them to friends if they're willing to have them, and give them over. But those are two things. How do you, Tenzin?
I think for me, it's I think I mean, patience is one thing that it's like whenever you're doing a new form or you're learning a new form, patience is one thing. It's interesting because, in some ways I won't say I'm an artist, or I won't say, I dabble with art. I'm just interested in it. And I think part of the thing with certain forms of training and engagement with art has allowed to nurture, I think, certain sort of aspects of the mind that have been helpful. I mean, humility being one of the things, patience, and then certain sense of sort of creative, I would say, bridge building. It's in a sense that in some ways art has ironically even allowed me to become better at perspective taking, which I believe is a very important form of learning, to be able to take perspective. But I actually wanted to put somebody on spot on this thing. Rodrigo, are you still there?
Yes, Tenzin, I'm here.
So Rodrigo is a dear friend who's a professor at Yale, at the School of Management, and I wanted to ask him because Rodrigo, are you still learning piano with your son?
Yes, I am.
Any insights?
I mean, obviously, when you were having this conversation, and I almost fell off my chair when you called on me because I was not expecting it. But so just to give people context, when my son turned about 5, I thought that it would be a very interesting project to take piano lessons together. I've never been musically trained. And I just thought it would be an interesting thing for both of us to try to learn something together. And, everything that you're both saying right now about, the humility, the perspective taking, the joy of learning something new for the first time, and being able to let go of expectations about, how good should I be given that I'm 45 years old, right? How good should I be at something at this stage of my life? It's been incredibly refreshing to be able to say, like, I'm going to suck at this for a very, very long time. And that's okay. And, if I'm learning a new piece, I know that it's going to take me a lot longer than it takes my 7-year-old son, which is, at the same time humbling and sometimes infuriating and sometimes inspiring, depending on which day of the week or which day of my practice you catch me. And so there's just a lot there. Like, there's a lot there in terms of, noticing moments when I am having these expectations about how good I should be. And it's like, well, why should I be good at this? Like, I'm just learning. Or kind of the freedom that comes with releasing that expectation and just, dwelling in the joy of learning. And as Marko was saying, like, the joy and the surprise of once in a while, I'll play a piece and it'll sound kind of okay. And it's amazing, and it's so joyous, and it doesn't happen that frequently, but it happens frequently enough that then I want to do it again. I want to practice more and try something a little bit harder to see if I can maybe at some point hit that piece in a decent way. So thank you, Tenzin, for asking. And there's just so much there that it really is something that has kind of pushed me to think about what other things do I want to learn at this stage of my life that I'd be starting from scratch.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Marko, there's a question here. How do you prepare for a performance? Any rituals, mental or physical preparation?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Just for context, my main work has been as a product designer and user interface designer and an entrepreneur in technology. And now I've come back to the arts, but took a long 15-year break. So I started with violin. I was quite a mediocre violinist. Was lucky to run into bass, and so I played fretted and fretless bass, which I turned to in my teens, which was a much better instrument for me. And I played with lovely people at the time I was in university and also teaching university. But then I took a 15-year break, and I bumped into, at the Fab Lab at MIT, I bumped into another person 5 years ago, Nadia Peak, who said, "Why don't we start a band?" And I will never stop playing again. I think it's starting from a health and well-being point of view, and neurologically, the evidence is overwhelming. But so that's what I'm doing. And right now, my practice is mainly playing the bass. I don't think there's anything magical other than the normal warm-ups of voice, and which are technical things having to do with the motor system. I typically do something. I will do a kind of mindfulness exercise, but then just before going on stage, I typically do something very physical for it's even just 30. It's like intervals, just to get blood in circulation and get going with that. But interestingly, I use the other way around. I use music for other things. If I had to give a talk in front of a large audience or something, or a difficult situation, I use particular pieces. I think everyone has those pieces, and it's said that Obama used to always listen in the first presidential election that he then won. Before going to the debates, he would have the last thing would be the earpiece that comes out. He always listened to Eminem's "Lose Yourself." Opportunity comes once in a lifetime. And that may be not your track, but the point is that it was. So I have I've been listening to one remix by Rival Consoles, who's an electronic musician I like. And that is what I listen to get sort of energized before. But that was my answer. Interested in any other practices that people have.
Any other questions or thoughts before we bring this conversation to a close? Well,
I think there may be one. Someone is typing.
Oh, you can see people typing?
Or is there? Leaning forward at least. Okay, I think Ida Marie Corell is there.
Oh,
you can also speak it, I think.
Yeah. You'll need to, here, let me, yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
I was wondering, the spiritual art you were talking about, do you make any link sometimes to the visuals you might have when you are in a spiritual art world, when you maybe see music, or you combine the mental and the meditative state with the visuals? Does it ever happen for you that the painting comes closer and it merges into your meditative state?
That's a very good question. Yes, I think there are two sort of, distinct genres of art, but also leading to two distinct experiences. One is that there's a whole sort of tradition of drawing and painting mandalas, these sort of circular geometric forms with some basic sort of primary colors in it. And historically, those patterns arose in sort of either during the meditation or post-meditation. Meditators would have sort of these visual sort of cues after coming out of or emerging out of meditation, and they would sort of then draw it or paint it from memory. And that has over the years also sort of evolved. And over a period, there will be mandalas that would then get associated with particular qualities, such as, if you meditate on this, it would increase compassion. If you meditate on this, it would increase a sense of fearlessness or sense of interconnectedness. And Carl Jung was particularly drawn towards the mandalas. And so in his work, when he was talking about art and healing, as a sort of psychotherapy or psychoanalytical process, he would try to sort of talk about mandalas. But the other part of the aesthetic experience, because especially the version of Buddhism that I'm part of in Tibetan Buddhism, there's this strong emphasis on visualization practices. And so oftentimes it would happen that if you're meditating on a word of art, that it's a kind of it's a different degree of saying that the work has come alive, and that you're suddenly part of that experience. And that's kind of the beauty of it, in terms of both the experience of loss of self, but merging into the work of art in a manner that your whole sort of ground reality shifts in a certain way. And it could be a very simple kind of experience. I remember many years ago, I was in a cave in Ladakh, and no electricity there. And in this cave, so we had candles, and the cave has been around for 1,000 odd years. And inside the cave, there were these murals that were painted by various meditators, again, over a period of time. And sitting there, and when you're in a cave without a watch, you kind of lose sense of day and time, kind of thing. And at night, it was dark, and you would light a candle, and suddenly the whole wall will get illuminated with these artworks. And of course, these are images of deities, of Buddhas, of enlightened beings, of experiences, and so on. And you're sitting there, and suddenly, sort of, you're in a different plane altogether, and it's just this kind of floating experience in some ways that would shift things. So I don't know if that sort of responds to your questions, but at least in visual kind of practices, those are the things. But then, of course, in terms of the chanting and the recitation, there are other kinds of qualitative religious experiences that one witnesses, or in composition of poetry or certain kinds of devotional writing. So it's all sort of quite wonderful exploration.
May I ask? I'm aware that Ida Marie Corel, who just asked the question, she has a multi-year artistic practice of investigating synesthesia in her own work. What in contemplative practices is the approach to synesthesia? How is it viewed?
Which particular aspect of synesthesia are you working with?
I think I'm at the point where I have realized that there are many different types of synesthesias in my condition, and I'm trying to bring them all together, maybe. So of course the traditional ones, but I think I find my point right now at the crossroads, where I have come to such a understanding towards my own perceptions that I can explain it, and I put it out there. So I use music and color and text and installation, also movement, trying to bring it someday, one point in my life, maybe into one. Yeah.
I think it's all it's kind of all part of a grand process or an equation in some ways. I think, again, the idea of how should I put it? I think the idea that there is a semblance to all this, see, it's just a comforting idea, right? That we can bring it all together. But it could be that they are, separate experiences with some thread in it, and how much of it is sort of direct experience versus my own projections or understanding of it, driven by the attempt to convey and communicate it. Because the commonality that we seek at times is oftentimes driven by the urge of how do I express this, it's an interesting process and a contemplative aspect that when you lose the urge to express it, but simply to be with it, simply to experience it, something also shifts qualitatively, and this is one of the key elements of coming back to the sense of solitude, that when we try to sit quietly, in the most simplest act of solitude, when we try to sit quietly and the mind is full of narration, the voice that keeps telling you, and the voice then also that attempts to describe to you what the silence is, what this experience of solitude is, to the point that at times you catch yourself and you say, I would like solitude even from this act of narration, and I would like this narrator to be absent. See? And it helps to say that I am not desiring to communicate it either to myself or to others, but to simply witness or witness it or to simply be with it. And so then this sort of, I don't want to say a purer form of silence, but a refined form of silence, where the narrator is no longer there and this urge is no longer there. And then you're simply it, you see, with the experience. I think that would be also a remarkable sort of attempt to sort of be in and to sustain it in some ways. Any last thoughts, Marko?
Well, your last comment reminded me, in another context, you were, if I recall correctly, sharing a practice of kind of, you were using the metaphor, if you like, of fading. So watching a thought fade out until the next tune starts up. And I think I replied that, yeah, I don't feel like I'm the DJ, somebody else is playing the record.
Yes.
But in this moment, someone asked, how long can you stay before the new song fades in, the new thought fades in? And you said something about many stories, but then you described it as a very joyous state. And then I was just speaking with an artist earlier today, and he was describing his meditative practice before or after working. And he used these words, it's something like that. I really find those times when I can get there, it's a vast, joyous expanse of emptiness. And so maybe that's the good thing to end on. And here's hoping for a good DJ.
Thank you so much. And maybe I'll just leave you all with this calligraphy that's behind me. It was done by a dear friend of mine who was a Zen priest and an abbot of Tofuguji in Kyoto, which is a national treasure. And he has, of course, was a delightful individual and has passed away a couple of years ago. But this calligraphy, it says, "Every day is a fine day," and it's that as we close this, wishing you that this day be fine, but also to sort of just bring it to the periphery of your remembrance that every day is a fine day, and begin with that thought. So thank you so very much for taking time, and thank you again, Marko, for the delightful conversation. Stay healthy, everyone. Bye-bye.